Hello, and welcome to the Self-Sufficient Hub podcast. I'm Carl from selfsufficienthub.com, and I'm here to talk about all things self-sufficiency. Sustainability and food security matters. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 258 of the Self-Sufficient Hub podcast. I hope you're all safe and well. No interview today, it's another solo episode, but I'm, treating it as a positive that I haven't had a chance to record an interview this week, because it does allow me this extra space to do an episode on what we're seeing in our shops at the moment. And at least here in the UK, and I'll apologise in advance to our listeners from around the world, because this is particularly timely here in the UK as we're seeing petrol shortages. It was very, very difficult for me to actually find fuel for my car this week to enable me to go to work. And we're seeing lots of empty shelves in the supermarket as well. Now, the reason I say that's I started with an apology for those elsewhere around the world is because we are all in very different circumstances. But whether or not you're facing these kinds of problems now, chances are you have at some point over the last few months, or perhaps you will in the near future, because we do live in a world where our commerce is all interconnected. And we're going to talk a little bit about that now. We're going to talk a little bit about why we're seeing the sort of problems that we are, how, self-sufficiency is a fantastic tool to protect yourself against so many of them, and, just how everything is interconnected and the effect that may or may not have on the supply chain where you are. Now, right off the bat, I want to say this is not a call to arms to go and panic buy. Far, far, far from it. A lot of the problems in the past we've seen have been caused by panic buying, and that's not the message here. But the message here, I suppose, ultimately is to be aware of your surroundings, be aware of the interconnectivity of the global supply chain and the markets and the world that we live in, and just be aware that wherever we live in the world, your country is almost certainly not self-sufficient in everything. And, when things get connected this way, there are vast benefits to be had from it insofar as production and, being economical with labour and materials and cost, and things can become much cheaper if we all connect and share everything. And that's basically how we've been able to grow as a civilization to the point we have. But there is a downside. If all those dominoes are connected, it only takes one of them to be removed and the whole chain will stop falling in place as it's supposed to. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a CO2 shortage, which is predominantly here in the UK, but is definitely felt elsewhere in the world, and the sort of knock-on effect that has. That's where we're going to start, but we're going to get into, no fuel at the petrol pumps and all those things as well. So have you heard that there's a CO2 shortage? Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. But at the moment, we have a severe shortage of CO2. And what does that mean? Why is that a problem? Well, CO2 is actually used for a number of different things. It's used in the slaughter of animals, in the stunning of animals. It's also used for extending shelf life of food. And it's also used in things like cooling nuclear power plants and even in some surgical operations. So it's definitely, a piece of the economy that when it gets hit, we notice. And the reason that we're seeing such a hike, a problem in CO2 and a hike in the costs of acquiring it, is because wholesale gas prices have gone up by around 250% this year since January. And there's been a 70% rise just since August, so in the last month or so. And what that's meant is two of the plants that produce fertiliser here in the UK, in Teesside and in Cheshire, they've both shut down due to that hike in gas prices. And CO2 is a byproduct of their operation. So when those plants closed, that accounted for about 60% of the CO2 that the UK produced. And all of a sudden, there was a massive, massive shortage. So while, there's no reason to think that we're going to run out of food or, anything else, there is a real possibility that we're going to go to the supermarket and certain things that we're used to seeing won't be there. And I think as homesteaders, we can build resilience into our way of living and make it so that these kinds of changes and these sudden changes in behavior and sudden items missing suddenly from the shelves are things that we can be somewhat immune from. Now, a little bit of it, I suppose, ties into the whole idea of preparing and just being prepared for little hiccups. Things like not having to go to the supermarket every single week. That doesn't mean that you don't, but the idea that, if you skipped a week, it wouldn't hurt you. That idea of just having enough of everything at home to last you a little bit longer than perhaps people would usually allow for. Now, I think here at the homestead, obviously, we can go almost indefinitely because of how we are set up. And I've kind of proved that in my September challenge. But the other thing that has become rapidly available to me to see is that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be easy, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be able to eat the way we're used to. So having lots of things, just, a spare packet of salt perhaps, or a spare this or a spare that, one more than you would normally have at hand, is really, really useful. Now isn't necessarily the time to run out and start stocking up your larders if you haven't already done that, because apart from other reasons, food prices are fairly high at the moment. In fact, prices across the board are rising astronomically. And again, that's something we're going to talk about more a little bit later. But, we are expecting there to be problems around Christmas. We're expecting there to be perhaps a shortfall of turkeys this year. Now, I don't want to be scaremongering, and I don't want to, again, cause panic buying. That is the opposite of what I'm trying to do. But what I'm trying to do is suggest that perhaps we allow a little bit extra resilience in our own systems so that when these problems occur, we can become part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And what do I mean by that? Well, when the panic buying for toilet roll occurred earlier in the year, which I think is something we've all experienced wherever we are in the world, we, as a family, as a household, who kind of always are prepared for the eventuality that things aren't available, we already had plenty of loo roll here at the house. So not only did we not have to worry about it, but we could actually remove ourselves from that cycle and actually remove the amount that we would usually purchase from the supermarket from that problem for a period of a month or two. And in doing so, we, not only weathered the storm, but we also alleviated the problem because our personal purchases were removed from that system that was facing the pressure. So by being prepared, by having a little bit spare on hand, we were able to not only avoid the problem, but we were able to become part of the solution. And I'm urging everyone to kind of do the same, by taking up a little bit of the responsibility for the resilience that's needed in these systems ourselves, we can put ourselves in a very good place. And whether you do that from a point of view of selfishness for your own good, and there's nothing wrong with that, or whether you do it from a point of for the greater good, these are both good reasons to make sure that you've got everything you need for probably, twice the amount of time that you would usually, if you usually do a weekly shop and by the end of the week you've come to the end of your food supplies or close to it, then perhaps you should consider having 2 weeks worth of food in the house. If you shop daily, consider just extending the amount of time that you're self-sufficient for, I suppose, is what I'm talking about. And by self-sufficient in this context, I'm talking about just food on hand, and disposable things on hand, all the consumables that we need, not just in things we grow and procure ourselves. So we are expecting the price increases to continue almost across the board. And this, in the UK at least, and again, I imagine this translates to many of you, whether it translates to you as timely as it will to those here in the UK is another matter. But here in the UK, we're facing a real smorgasbord of problems. We've got the energy price increases with, I think, 7 energy providers actually going bust in the last few weeks. We've got the fuel shortages across the nation. As far as I'm aware, it's nationwide. The petrol stations are almost all empty, and it's very, very difficult to find fuel for your vehicles. And of course, if you're someone like me, you also might need fuel for other things, for instance, generators, or at work, a digger, which I'm using at the moment. So, that compounds everything else. There's also post-Brexit issues with Labour, and, we were formerly part of the European Union, and we used to have a free trade border insofar as labour markets were concerned, and a tremendous number of our delivery drivers were from the EU, and many of those have now returned to their country of origin and are not here delivering goods to our supermarkets anymore, and lots of other things. A global interconnectivity has driven also a huge hike in the cost of lumber and timber materials. We've seen most of our timber materials go up by around 120% over the last year or so, at least where I am. And, that also has a huge knock-on effect. And it's our job as homesteaders to insulate ourselves, not from the world, but from some of these problems, because we're in a very fortunate position that we're already plugged into that way of thinking, and we get to tap into that reservoir of ideas now to help simplify and make our lives that little bit more comfortable than they might otherwise be if we're so readily reliant on things being available at the shops. You can now support the show directly. Just go to patreon.com/self-sufficient-hub. You can become a patron and set up to donate to the show from any amount. Pledging as little as $3 a month makes a huge difference. If that's not your thing, you can also support the show by sharing it with people you know or posting about it on social media. We really appreciate all the help that you give us. It's people like you that make this show possible. So what exactly are we looking at shortages of? Well, here in the UK, I'm going to run through the sort of things that are on my mind and where we're looking like we are and where we're looking like we might be in a few weeks. So food supplies is the first one to think about. And as I've mentioned before, there is a huge CO2 shortage, and that's critical in the food supply chain because it's used in packaging and meat production. So the closure of fertilizer plants is having that huge knock-on effect in the food industry. And big companies like Bernard Matthews, who produce a tremendous number of the turkeys that are consumed here in the UK, the owner of that company has said that supply issues as well as a shortage of workers will affect the supply of turkeys for Christmas. CO2 is injected into the packaging of lots of perishable foods, including meat and salad, and it's used to prevent the growth of bacteria, and it can prolong the shelf life for up to 5 days in things like beef. And as you can imagine, when you're transporting these things around the country, those 5 days are absolutely critical. And I'm not sure that, how the companies are planning on getting around this insofar as once they've packaged that meat, actually getting on the shelf soon enough so that it can be sold if they don't have those additional 5 days. Because quite often when you're shopping for things like fresh meat, the best before or use by date might not be much more than 5 days when you buy it. So there's lots of potential issues there. And the chief executive of the Food and Drink Federation in the UK, Ian Wright, has said that consumers could start noticing shortages in poultry, pork and bakery products in the next few days. Now, we're facing shortage of not only those products, but also things like crisps and pet food, beer and wine, and any carbonated drinks, because those are all things that CO2 are used for. But outside of the food industry, there's talk now of there even being potential shortages of Christmas trees, with retailers are, warning that following the labour and supply chain difficulties, since around 1/10 of the real Christmas trees here in the UK are imported, which isn't a tremendous amount, but 10% is not nothing. The post-Brexit regulations have, not helped really to they've exacerbated a problem that was already there in a stretched labour market, and that could lead to shortages and higher demand for those locally grown trees. And as with all of these issues, they're all going to be exasperated by one other overarching factor, which is the shortage of lorry drivers. So we've been hit here in the UK, and I think this might be an issue that's particularly focused here in the UK due to things like Brexit, is that the UK has been hit by a shortage of lorry drivers, and it's a crisis that's affected supermarkets, restaurants, every retailer really, and the shortfall has been triggered by an exodus of those foreign nationals, as I mentioned before, due to, well, yes, the post-Brexit immigration rules, but also more recently the self-isolation requirements that have come into place due to COVID, and lots of, well, in every sector, lots of workers are finding themselves pinged by the COVID app that we have here in the UK and having to self-isolate. And this is affecting big and small retailers alike. You know, some of our bigger chains are, bigger restaurant chains, McDonald's, KFC, Subway, Nando's, Greggs, all of these are among food retailers impacted by the truck driver shortages, but also our supermarkets, Tesco, Sainsbury's, Morrison's, Co-op, Iceland, all of these have been affected by supply chain shortages, and it's likely to carry on. But obviously, again, this comes with a caveat not to start panic buying, just to judiciously buy a tiny amount more than maybe you would usually. So, this is something that we're not really sure when the end is going to come. There's a significant shortage in drivers, and we really don't know. We're not yet seeing the light at the end of the tunnel on this one. And all of these difficulties we've been talking about are bleeding across into other sectors as well, including things like the pet food industry. So again, we're talking about major supermarkets like Sainsbury's and Tesco's are both reporting widespread shortages of pet food, or at least they were reporting them back in March due to unanticipated high demand, with supply predominantly affecting wet food pouches for dogs and cats. And there's concern now that these shortages could worsen into the winter as, those empty shelves become more noticeable, and there's a kind of effect that compounds itself as people take that as a sign to panic buy. And of course, another item on many people's shopping list is beer. And from the 1st of September, Wetherspoons announced, Wetherspoons is a large chain of brewery-owned pubs here in the UK, and it announced that it was really having trouble getting hold of Carling and Coors beers. That was the knock-on effect of industrial action taken by drivers acting on behalf of another brewer, Molson Coors, which makes those brands, and they cited the HGV driver shortage. The manufacturer of Johnny Walker and Guinness said that the problem was due to logistics and shipping around the world and on procuring some of the packaging materials. And this is where we're getting into the realms of it may not be the actual industry itself that's having an issue. For instance, this is one from personal experience. Cement is something that we use a tremendous amount of in the building industry, and not too long ago, maybe 2 months ago, it was really difficult to buy cement here in the UK, just at our local builders merchants. And it wasn't because the cement factories were struggling, it was because they couldn't get hold of the plastic for the packaging. Now, we may look at that as a sign of something that could be cured in the industry by trying to move away from these harmful chemicals and these harmful practices, and I would agree with you, but it's indicative of a general problem within the supply chain also. We're seeing this problem in electronics as the actual manufacturer of the raw materials are shutting down temporarily. We've got lots of components in electronics and in microchips that come from places like Asia, and there's been lots of closures there due to the pandemic, and those shortages have led to a halt in global manufacturer of lots of microchips and cars and all those kinds of things, construction materials as well. The idea is, when we're connected in this way, when we have a supply chain that is so reliant on 100 different steps in it, it only takes one of those steps for those frailties to really become apparent at the till, where we're trying to buy. So where are we going? Where are we going from here? Well, my feeling, and this should only be taken as such, I don't have a PhD in these matters, but my feeling is that this is a problem that is likely to widen and deepen. Not significantly. I don't think we're going to ever get to the point where, people literally cannot buy food to eat. But I do think these problems are going to widen and deepen. And I think, like I say, we have a responsibility to each other, but we also have a responsibility to ourselves and our families to make it so that we're not the ones in the position of really struggling and really facing the hardships of not being able to buy something that for our family is essential. And we can protect ourselves from doing this by, adding those resilience ideas to our system, whether it's simple things like food storage and just making sure that we have enough of our own food stored in our house that we're able to feed our family for a slightly longer period than we might otherwise deem necessary, or whether it's by, just using less. Perhaps we decide not to make those superfluous trips in our car and, save that fuel, whatever it might be. I'm just raising the banner, really, raising the flag for self-reliance and self-responsibility. And, we can all take responsibility for our own small part of the problem and become our own small part of the solution. And I hope this hasn't come across too much as doom and gloom. I think it's just a frank reflection on where we are. It's certainly what I'm seeing out there at the moment. And I will repeat what I said at the top, that, if you're elsewhere in the world, then perhaps you're not seeing any of these issues. And I hope that you don't. But maybe, even if you're not, that's really the time to take account of your position and make it so that should these things happen where you are, you're not going to be too affected by it. The time to make personal changes and the time to build those resilient systems, the time to put yourself in a position where you're not at the whims and vagaries of a market is when the market is fine. That's when prices are going to be lowest. That's when your ability to do these things aren't going to cause a problem to your neighbours. The time to go out and stock up on toilet roll is not when there is a shortage. Hopefully we've all learnt that lesson. Anyway, that's going to wrap this episode up. Thanks for listening, everyone, and I will speak to you on Friday. Cheers. If you find this podcast valuable, there's several ways you can support it. The easiest of which is to rate and review it wherever you get your podcasts. You could also talk about it or share it wherever you post online, including your social media pages. And now you can support the podcast directly by becoming a patron at patreon.com/self-sufficient-hub. However you support the podcast, we really appreciate it. Thank you for listening. See you soon.